Welcome to a very special virtually speaking event. We're branching out slightly this evening with the first of 3 French literature tutorials with Latimer legend Peter Winter. Peter is making an ambitious start, as might be expected of a former Latimer head, with La Cygne, the Swan, by Charles Baudelaire. Early in his teaching career, Peter taught French at Latimer, and I'm delighted to see some of his former students here with us this evening. Welcome back to class, everyone. We're planning 3 stages to this tutorial. First, Peter will set the scene for you with a brief history of the poet's life and works. Then he'll read through La Cygne, stanza by stanza, exploring the language and meaning of the poem. As model students, I'm sure you've all done your homework and read the poem prior to this evening. If not, you've got about 3 minutes to do so. In the final section of the tutorial, we'll all discuss the poem, share observations, and ask any questions you may have. Of course, unlike normal Latimer tutorials, there's no obligation to say anything if you'd rather not. It might sound slightly counterproductive to ask you to keep your mics off during the first part of the tutorial, but we'd ask you to keep them muted until we start the discussion so that we can all hear Peter clearly. Do type your questions in the chat facility to the right of your screen so that we can discuss them after the reading or make a note of them. For those of you who haven't attended one of our virtually speaking events before, I'd encourage you to take a look at the excellent talks given by our alumni, Latimer parents and teachers on a really eclectic array of topics. We'll be sharing links to the full virtually speaking collection at the end of this tutorial. As well as keeping our Latimer community connected in the absence of face-to-face events, this programme of talks also helps us raise funds for our bursaries programme. And I want to thank both our speakers and you, the audience, for supporting us. Many of you made a donation when registering for this evening, which has raised over £300 for this year's annual bursaries appeal. So thank you very much for that. It just remains for me to welcome Peter for his tutorial on La Cygne by Charles Baudelaire. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Sian, very much indeed, and good evening, everybody. And it's a delight to be amongst so many old faces that I recognise, old friends and former colleagues, and a number of former pupils. It's quite an eclectic group, I gather, tonight, some 40 of us. So it's great to have you on board, and thank you for your indulgence. I'd like to salute in particular 4 individuals who I believe are here tonight, and their names are recorded in the very first 2 registers I had as a young schoolmaster at Latter in 1973. And these documents never lie. This is the very first register I had as a young teacher, my first term, and we have here Alpha 1, and in this class were a certain Rupert Harding and a certain Howard Witt, who I believe are in the audience this evening. And in my second year in Beta 1, again, this register has a certain Jamie Grant and also Keith Wells, so at least 4. I'm sure there may be others, but by the way, in these documents are recorded my report comments, which I won't read out this evening, you'll be glad to know. But you guys, you 4, were amongst the very earliest guinea pigs in my teaching career, and I salute you and welcome you back to the laboratory, the vivisection laboratory. Thank you very much for being there. Now, I hope you have an apéro. It is the apéro time, and I have a nice little Languedoc local wine made about a mile from our house in France. It's a little mixture of Grenache Blanc and Viognier, which is going to keep me company. And while I have a glass in my hand, if you will allow one very brief indulgence, the Winter family today is a very happy family because we are celebrating the arrival of our 3rd grandchild, little Effie, Matthew and Helen's first child. And she was born very prematurely, 8 weeks early, and she's been in hospital, in King's College Hospital, for the last 7 weeks. Initially in intensive care, we've had an anxious time, but yesterday she came home, and about an hour ago, Matthew and Helen showed her to us. So we are over the moon, I think is the comment, and I'd like you to join me in wishing Effie a long, happy and healthy life. Cheers.
Good health, Effie.
Here she is, by the way. I don't know if you can see her.
Thank you. Now, my subject tonight is Baudelaire. And let me take you to our first picture. Lynn has prepared a PowerPoint to a portrait which is hanging in the main hall at Latimer. And oops, now there's a slight pause now because when that's come up, I've now lost my text. So bear with me, my technical assistant is going to get the text back for me. Here we are, I've got the text. I need a picture as well. How does that work? Anyway, I'll keep talking. In the main hall at Latimer, as those of you Latimerians will know, hang the august portraits of former headmasters. And here is one, actually me looking, I think, uncharacteristically nervous and also inebriated, which people may not think is uncharacteristic. But I'm holding up, the reason I show you this portrait is because I am holding a book.
Hold on, we have a problem. Houston, we have a
there's
problem.
a slight technical pause here because I need to see, click on that.
Yeah, no, we've lost it.
I've lost the PowerPoint, so I'm not seeing what you are seeing. But anyway, and I want to, can you see me? I don't know if you can see me. Ah, yes, you can see me. I'm holding up the very book that I'm holding in that portrait. And there is a little story behind this. And the story is that back in 1970 or 69, in my first year at Wadham College, Oxford, I was invited to a scholars' dinner by the warden. He was a very famous man, Sir Maurice Barra. And we had a typically bibulous Oxford evening. And at the end of the evening, he said, "You boys should come back tomorrow. I'm retiring at the end of the year. I'm going to give away some of my books." And we went back the next morning and his desk was piled high with various tomes. And I picked this book up rather randomly. And here it is. It's a very beautiful edition of Baudelaire's poetry. And while I speak on edition, I have another book here, which is actually a gift from Jamie, which I'm very grateful for my 60th birthday. This is a beautiful, I don't know if you can see it, Pleiad edition of Baudelaire's poetry. And in it, not only his poetry, but also his notebooks. And you can see here, this is a list of his debts when he was, and money will be a theme which I'll return to later. So that's a Latimer context for Baudelaire. And there's another connection too. When I was headmaster at Latimer for the last 10 years of my career, I offered what was called extension class to sixth formers who were studying A-level French and who were interested in the possibility of reading modern foreign languages at university. And I would do a weekly class with these students, which was great fun for me. I don't know how it was for them. And I often chose a poem because of its manageable size and the fact that it's self-contained. And I rather like challenging myself to choose a poem that I didn't know particularly. And this is how I came to get into Baudelaire. And at this moment, I offer you a disclaimer. I do not profess to be an expert on Charles Baudelaire. I didn't study him at Oxford. In fact, one of the people listening today, I hope, is a very old friend of mine, Tim, in Luxembourg, who read modern languages with me at Wadham, who chose Baudelaire as a special author. And we all lived the intense 4 weeks while Tim studied Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal together. And it really kind of messed with our minds. He's a difficult poet to get into, and he addresses difficult themes. And so I avoided Baudelaire at university. I was a bit scared of him, to be honest. So I've discovered him late, and it's been a delightful discovery. My preferred teaching method was borrowed from the French. It's called explication de texte. And that is to take a short literary passage and to subject it to close critical analysis. Basically, the aim is to teach students how to read, what questions they should ask of a text. And it's a very simple method. You begin, it has 5 stages. Stage 1 is set the context. Stage 2, identify the principal theme or themes of the extract. 3 is subject matter and how that is developed. 4 is style. That's often taken in conjunction with subject matter, and then 5, some you try it all together at some form of conclusion. So let's move now on to Baudelaire himself. Can I have the second picture up, please, Lynn? And there you have a nice picture of Baudelaire, and over my shoulder here you can see another picture of Baudelaire, which is a very popular one. Baudelaire did not have a happy life. He was born in 1821 and died at the age of 46 in 1867. His father died early when he was 6, and his beloved mother remarried really quite quickly within a year, a General Oppic, a distinguished military man and subsequently a diplomat. Charles's mother hoped that the young Charles, who was clearly a bright young thing, would follow in his stepfather's footsteps, in other words, a solid middle-class career. But Charles was set on a literary career, which is what he undertook as a poet, as an essayist, as an art critic. He was a great champion of Delacroix, and as a translator, he was really the Frenchman to translate Edgar Allan Poe and make him very popular in France. And Edgar Allan Poe had a similarly distressing life, an end to his life. But Baudelaire never wrote the novels which he promised his dear mamma he would write. Because he showed early signs of a dissipated lifestyle, his parents, or mother and stepfather, put him on a ship to Calcutta to make a man of him, I suppose. And he suffered this for a few months, but eventually jumped ship when he got to Mauritius and returned to the taverns of Paris. But his travels did give him some experience of the exotic, which reappears in some of his poetry. Over time, the relationship with his stepfather became toxic. There's a story in 1848 when there was a revolution in France. Baudelaire, of course, was on the barricades, as every self-respecting Republican would be, and he tried to raise a rabble to go and shoot General Oppic, his stepfather. He was unsuccessful in raising enough enthusiasm. I forgot to tell you, by the way, that as a young boy, he was expelled from school, the famous Lycée Louis Le Grand in Paris. His master asked him to pass a note which he'd been given by another boy, and Charles stood up, refused to pass it on to him, tore it up into pieces and ate it in front of the teacher. As a result, he was expelled. So Charles had a bit of character. When he was 21, he received a very significant inheritance. He was bourgeois, he was middle class, but I'm afraid he squandered it and spent a lifetime in debt. He blew his money on prostitutes, he frequented brothels, he experimented with drugs and booze, and he squandered his money on fancy clothes. He was something of a dandy and a man about town, and any family attempt to regulate his spending caused great resentment. So the remainder of his life was really chasing money, managing his debts, and writing pleading letters to his mother to bail him out. Baudelaire believed in God, but could not resist the pursuit of pleasure and was tormented by a truly Catholic sense of guilt and sin. His relationship with women in particular was complex. He was greatly attracted to them physically, but also repelled by them and by some of the physical aspects of sex. It didn't help, perhaps, that as a result of his first sexual experience at the age of 16, he contracted gonorrhea, and he graduated from that to suffer from full-blown syphilis, which some suspect may have led to his early death. He abused alcohol, in particular a drug called laudanum, which was the tincture of opium. It was the drug of choice of most 19th century poets. Coleridge was an addict. It was freely available and cheap, and it was a painkiller, but it was very addictive. And he took it initially as a treatment for the ravages of syphilis, and also, I think, to escape from the sordid realities of his existence, which oppressed him. He had 3 relationships with women, but the most important by far was a very long and stormy relationship with Jeanne Duval, who was Haitian, mixed French and Black African heritage. He called her his Black Venus, his Venus Noire, his muse. And he probably loved her most of all his mistresses, although she treated him cruelly and sponged off him. I don't suppose he treated her particularly well either. In fact, it's arguable that the only woman he ever loved was his mother. The first edition of his poems, Les Fleurs du Mal, was published in 1857, and he was immediately prosecuted for obscenity and convicted, as a result of which 6 poems were removed from this anthology, known as Les Épaves, the shipwrecks, and they were only published later and separately. Over the next 4 years, he wrote more poems, one of which, Le Cygne, my subject tonight, and they were published in a second edition of Les Fleurs du Mal in a section called Tableaux Parisiens, Scenes of Parisian Life, in 1861. Baudelaire was disenchanted with the reception given to his flowers, his beautiful poetry. People didn't understand him. He talked about literary scum, the critics that criticized him. And in disgust, he basically moved to Belgium in 1864, a kind of self-imposed exile, which is the theme of tonight's poem. And 2 years later, in 1866, he was in a church examining a particular pew in a church when he collapsed with a cerebral hemorrhage. He then, within the next few days, suffered a succession of minor strokes and lapsed into a condition which doctors apparently call aphasia. It's like a locked-in syndrome. Basically, he was unable to communicate with the outside world, but remained fully conscious, able to hear and to see. And he lived in this hell for over a year. He was brought back to Paris, where his mother held his hand, and he died in August 1867. The following year, for the first time, a complete version of Les Fleurs du Mal was published in 1868. We can now go to the next slide, Lynn. I want to give you the physical context of his poem. And here you see a bridge over the River Seine. It's actually the Pont du Carrousel. And you have to imagine in our poem that Baudelaire has walked over this bridge from left to right, going north. And if you look at the next slide, you see a schematic map of Paris, the center west of Paris. I don't know how well you can see this, but bottom right of this picture, you can just see the tip of the Ile de la Cité. And the next bridge going right to left is the Pont des Arts. And the next bridge, which is unnamed, is actually the Pont du Carrousel, which is the one I've just shown you. And imagine Baudelaire walking over that bridge north onto the right bank of Paris, and the Louvre, the Louvre is in front of him, and there's an archway he goes underneath, and he finds himself in the Place du Carrousel. I hope you can see that, due north of the bridge. And to the right of the Place du Carrousel is the Louvre, where the Pyramide du Louvre is now, if you know Paris. And to the left, stretching to the left, are the gardens of Les Tuileries gardens there, famous gardens. And at the end, the limit of the picture is the Place de la Concorde. If you can imagine that being extended further out west, you go to the Champs-Élysées, the famous Champs-Élysées, and the Place de l'Étoile, the Arc de Triomphe. And the context here, if we now look at picture 5, is a building operation. Basically, in the mid-1850s, we have Napoleon III is running France. He came into power as president of a republic, a second republic, in 1848. And after 3 years, he launched a coup d'etat and became emperor. This is the start of the Second Empire in 1852, which lasted 18 years until the Franco-Prussian War. And so this is our period, the Second Empire. And Napoleon III, who was a nephew of the great Napoleon, is the Empire of France. And one of the good things he did many bad things, But one of the good things he did was commission Baron Haussmann, an Alsacien, to recreate, completely reconfigure the center of Paris. And the Paris that we now see today and love is very much the result of this work. What is a bit like the big dig in Boston over recent years, a massive public works program. The whole of the center of Paris was demolished. And this is what Baudelaire is lamenting. He witnesses the scene of carnage and responds to it in his poem. In the third stanza, the word baraque appears, and this is the kind of scene, it's not actually exactly where the poem is set, but this is in Paris, and these are baraque huts, ramshackle huts. So that was what the old Paris was like. This center part of Paris, since the Middle Ages, had not changed. It was a hotbed of insurrection in Paris. It was unhealthy and insanitary. It encouraged repeated outbreaks of cholera. There was traffic chaos, all kinds of social unrest. One of the many reasons why Napoleon said, let us change this. And he used three verbs. Aérer, let us bring air, aerate the center of Paris. Unifier, unified, and embellir, and embellish it, make it beautiful. And so Haussmann began by restyling the Place du Carrousel, the first phase of his work. The second phase was the Grand Boulevard, which you will have strolled out of, which converge in the Place de l'Étoile. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is the Avenue de l'Opéra, the opera, Hitler's favorite building, was built. And this is just an example of the works and the sort of scene that would have been in front of Baudelaire when he has this moment which he captures in his poem. So can we have the picture, the first slide, next slide up, please, Lynn, which is the first half of his poem. And how do I get that up a little bit? Can you just get that up a little bit for me? Excuse me a moment, another slight technical hitch. I just want my text up a bit. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. So the theme, I've given you the physical context of the poem. And I've told you that this is a poem which forms part of Les Fleurs du Mal, it's part of the Tableau Parisien. He was an urban poet, the poet of Paris. And the theme of his poem, I'm going to argue, is exile, the grief caused by irrevocable loss, and also the transformative power of memory. And you'll see that he dedicates his poem to Victor Hugo at the top there. Victor Hugo, Baudelaire was no particular fan of Victor Hugo as a writer, as a poet, but he did admire his Republican spirit. Victor Hugo was an absolute opponent of Napoleon III. He was a true Republican. And when Napoleon III took over as emperor, he escaped France, went to live initially in Jersey, then Guernsey, and spent 20 years in the Channel Islands, where most of his great literature was written. And he wrote some wonderful vituperative poetry criticizing in very, very open terms Napoleon, called Les Châtiments, the chastisements from there. And so that explains why Baudelaire dedicates this poem, which is about exile, to an exile, Victor Hugo. Let me explain the other references in the poem before I go through it stanza by stanza. I hope help me to understand some of the sense of the poem. It begins with Andromache, the Trojan princess, the wife of Hector, who was the son of King Priam. And Andromache is the archetype of the tragic widow. At the end of the Trojan War, to try and put an end to the bloodshed, the #1 Trojan warrior, Hector, challenged the Greeks to put up their #1 warrior, Achilles, to do single combat in front of the walls of Troy, and the winner would take all. And history records that Achilles won this battle. Hector was killed. Andromache, his wife, widow, is watching this from the battlements of Troy. And Achilles then drags Hector's bloody corpse around the walls of Troy behind his chariot. Now you have to imagine that Andromache's grief has been heightened by this ghastly scene, the death and abuse of her husband, the abuse of his body. In the first stanza is the word Simois. It just refers to a river on the Trojan plain, nothing more than that. I'd never heard of that before. Later on in the poem, we come across Pyrrhus. He's important because he was the son of Achilles, and you'll see the tension there. And Pyrrhus, at the end of the Trojan War, takes Andromache, the man his father killed, as his concubine and his war booty. And Andromache is then the widow she's the widow of Hector. She is the captive of Pyrrhus, and she is ultimately forced to marry Helenus, who's actually her brother-in-law, Hector's brother. I don't know much about that, and it's not really significant to the poem. The other reference in the 7th stanza is to Ovid, the Roman poet, who again is a man who was exiled. He was exiled by Augustus, the Roman emperor, because he was unwise enough to suggest in a satirical poem that the emperor had indulged in inappropriate relations with a member of his family, incestuous relationships. And so he was banished to an obscure town called Tomis. I'd never heard of it, on the Black Sea, what is now Romania. And he wrote there some lovely lyrical poems called Tristia, sadnesses, expressing his despair at exile. Right, let's look at the poem now. When you look at a poem, the main thing about poetry is to respond to it. Any piece of literature, you need to respond to it. But let's just look at, if you like, the architecture of the poem. Here in front of you, you see the first half of the poem. It's in 2 parts. The first part consists of 7 stanzas. Each stanza has 4 lines. This is just the nuts and bolts of it. I won't go on at great length, but just so you know, these 4-line stanzas are called quatrains, quatrains, in French, 4-line stanzas. And you can see that there is a rhyme scheme. So if you look at the very first stanza, you'll see that the word fleuve, the last word of the first line, rhymes with the last word of the third line, fleuve, and verve, as resplendi rhymes with grandi. Now that in itself is not an earth-shaking revelation, but it's just to show there's a lot going on here. That's called a rime alternée, A, B, A, B. And as you go down, you'll see that that rhyme scheme is repeated in every stanza. If you just look at the very first line of the poem, you'll see that, I can tell you that that is a 12-syllable line called an Alexandrine, named after a medieval romance called the Romance of Alexandria, which is the first poem in French to be written in 12 syllables. The fundamental difference between English and French is that in French, every syllable has equal weight. If you take the English word indefensible, you can see that there is a stress on the 3rd syllable, indefensible, whereas in French that will be pronounced indéfensible, equal stress. And so French poetry works to very, very different rhythms to English poetry, which I think has more complex rhythms. And here, the first line and all of these lines actually have 12 syllables. Within that, you have to count a final E in French count. So andromaque is the 4th syllable. But if you carry on, je, syllable 5, passe, à vous, the E at the end of passe doesn't count as a syllable because it aligns with a, and then in the end, ce petit fleuve, final E at the end of a line doesn't count. So I don't want to become too boring on this subject, but there are 12 syllables in that line, and that is replicated in every line. So that's the basic structure, if you like, of the poem. Let's have a look briefly at the second half of the poem. Lynn, could you go to the next slide? And there you have the second part, which is 6 stanzas. Now, if you remember in the very first half of the poem, I had highlighted the very first phrase, Andromaque, je pense à vous. Andromache, I am thinking of you. I'll explain why he's thinking of her in a minute. But that structure, je pense à, is the fundamental dynamic of this poem. And it's picked up in the second half of the poem, which you're looking at, in the areas which the phrases which have been highlighted in that, what stanza is that? Stanza 9, is it? Yes, stanza 9. Je pense à mon grand Cygne. You'll see that replicated. Then on the right-hand side of the second one, je pense à la négresse. And then that à for I'm thinking of. Penser à is to think of. And so that à, pick it up in the penultimate stanza, à quiconque. I'm thinking of whoever. And then the line after, à ceux qui, of those who. And then the last line of the penultimate stanza, aux maigres, or always the plural of à, I'm thinking of the orphans. And then the final two stanzas, we build up to a climax, which I will come back to in due course. Now that is, I think, the essential dynamic of the poem and gives it its real flavor. And if I could just compare it with this, it's a figure of speech called anaphora, which is deliberate repetition of a phrase. And it's important because it draws the reader in. The insistent repetition provides emphasis. Let me just give you a couple of examples. In English, think of the beginning of the Tale of Two Cities, Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. That insistent repetition that immediately draws you in. And then another example, I won't mention Martin Luther King, I have a dream. Churchill, we shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Those are all examples, as the one in Le Cygne, of anaphora. Let us now turn to the first three stanzas. The next slide, please, Lynn, of the poem. So here at last, I hope you're still with me. Let us look at this poem in detail. I sent out a translation this morning. You may or may not use it. I chose it simply because it's quite literal. It doesn't claim to be great poetry. It was actually done in 1954, but it's quite literal. So if you don't have much French or any French at all, you can kind of match it up with the French. I'm now going to go through this stanza by stanza, explaining the French. I hope how it works, commenting on some of the themes, commenting on some of the stylistic aspects of the poem. And when I've completed that, I'll finish my talk by then reading the whole poem through once in French. So you can, I hope, appreciate some of the music of the poetry. So it begins with an exclamation, Andromaque, je pense à vous. I am thinking of you, the widow. He's thinking of the grief-stricken widow. What has prompted this thought? Well, he's seen a stream, ce petit fleuve. I don't know if it was the, can't really be the Seine because that's not a stream. This petit fleuve, this stream, a poor and sad mirror where jadis, in yesteryear and former times, was resplendent the immense majesty of your widow's griefs. This Cygne, this river on the Trojan plain, which is menteur, which is false. Why false? Because it's swollen by the tears which she is weeping. Obviously poetic exaggeration going on here big time, but it's false in that sense. It's doubled in size. The site of this little stream has seeded, has literally fertilized, a fécondé, fécond in English, suddenly, soudain, my fertile memory. Memory is a consistent, repeated theme in Baudelaire's poetry. It sparked off a train of thought. Comme je traversais le nouveau Carrousel. As I was crossing the new Carrousel, I think this refers to the square rather than the bridge. He's just outside the Louvre. Le vieux Paris n'est plus. Old Paris is no longer. The Paris which he knows and loves, the slums he was rather fond of, have been demolished. He's lamenting that. And in the bracket, the parenthesis, he says, cynically, the form of a town, a city, changes more quickly, hélas, alas, than the heart of a human being. It suggests that he doesn't have much truck with human constancy. And so he sees in his mind a picture. I can only, ne que, there, first line of stanza, I can only see in my mind, en esprit, this camp of huts, bahak. I showed you a picture earlier. These piles, these heaps, tas, of chapiteaux, capitals, the tops of columns, ébauchés, roughly hewn, et de fûts, and columns, les herbes, grass, wild grass growing, les gros blocs, great blocks of stone, verdis, gone green par l'eau des flaques, turned green by the water of the puddles. It's like a bomb site. Et brillant au carreau, and shining on the tiles. This I think, and my friend here has mistranslated carreau as windows. It's not windows here, it's tiles, shining on the tiles, the broken tiles which lay strewn about. A mishmash, confus, a mishmash, bric-a-brac, a French term which we use in English. So that's the initial image. Here we go on to the next 4 stanzas. At this point, in the past, and this is now an effect of his memory, was there s'étalait, there stretched out, jadis in past times, une ménagerie, a little zoo. Là, lots of repetition within the poem. I saw, je vis, I saw. And the picture which he saw, he now describes one morning, at a time, à l'heure où sous les cieux froids et clairs, where, or a time when beneath the cold and bright skies, workers were getting up. He uses le travail, work, as a kind of absolute noun with a capital T. Means the people, the working populace were rising to go to work. They were waking up, s'éveille. Où la voirie is the street cleaning operation. Pousse un sombre ouragan, was making an extraordinary din, a dark hurricane, literally, dans l'air silencieux. So that the street cleaners, all the people who are going to clear up the mess in the streets, were making an early din in the early morning silence. And then the object of the verb of the previous, je vis, I saw. What did he see? He saw un cygne, a swan, qui s'était évadé de sa cage, which had escaped from its cage. And de ses pieds palmés, its webbed feet, frottant le pavé sec, his webbed feet are rubbing along the dry paving stones. I'm sorry, I just lost my place there. And with his webbed feet rubbing along the dry paving stone. Everything is dry, there's no water. The point being that the swan is out of its natural element. Sur le sol, rapporteur, on the uneven ground, it was dragging, traîner, its white plumage. Près d'un ruisseau. Un ruisseau here means a gutter. There's a gutter, but there's no water in it. Sans eau, a waterless gutter. The animal ouvrant le bec, opening its beak, and the animal is about to be personified, is going to speak. Poetic license again. But ironically, he uses the first word of the next stanza, is baigner, was bathing. Of course, what is it bathing in? It's bathing in la poudre, the last word of that, in the dust, not in water. It's nervously, agitatedly bathing its wings, ses ailes, dans la poudre, in this dust, this dusty wasteland, and was crying out. It disait, le cœur, its heart, swelled with memories of the beautiful lake where it was born, de son beau lac natal. And here you have to allow the swan to speak, to apostrophize. Oh, water, when will you rain? That is the only case in the French language that I'm aware of where the verb pleuvoir, il pleut, you may know it, it's raining, is used in the tu form. When will you rain? He's speaking direct, he's appealing, beseeching the rain. Please rain, I need water. Quand Tonneras-tu, foudre? When will you crash? Thunder. Just in passing, note the beautiful chiasmus, O, mirrored by foudre at the end. So the two nouns at the end, at the beginning and end, and the two verbal constructions in the middle. O, quand pleuvras-tu, quand tonneras-tu, foudre. Beautiful classical balance of that line. And so Baudelaire continues, je vois, I now can see, but previously, je vis, I saw in the past, now je vois, in my memory, I can see this wretched, this hapless bird, ce malheureux, mythe, étrange et fatal, strange and fateful myth. The word myth suggests that the swan has a significance beyond itself. Vers le ciel, and it's basically thrusting its neck up towards the sky as it appeals to the cloud, towards the heavens, sometimes, quelquefois, like Ovid, another tragic exile, towards, again, vers le ciel is repeated, another feature of this repetition. Vers le ciel ironique, this ironic sky. Why is it ironic? Because it's beautiful blue, and the beauty of the sky is offset by the cruelty of the situation that the swan finds himself in. And with its eager neck, stretching its eager head convulsively as if he was addressing reproaches to God. Can we go to the next three? I need to hurry up. Paris is changing, but nothing in my melancholy has changed. That remains the same. New palaces, scaffolding, blocks of stone, old suburbs, everything for me becomes allegory, and it takes on then a wider significance in his imagination. And my dear memories are heavier, they weigh down on him, than rocks. And therefore, aussi at the beginning of a sentence means therefore, and so in front of the Louvre, which used to be the Palace of Kings, but now is the repository of the greatest art in France, one image oppresses me. And then the beginning of this anaphora, this insistent repetition. Je pense à mon grand Cid, I'm thinking of my great swan with its crazy gestures, like exiles. And the swan he describes as ridicule, ridiculous, laughable on one level, but sublime in another. That duality is central to Baudelaire. Rongé and gnawed away at by a desire, a ceaseless desire, centré. And then I think of you, Andromaque, fallen from the arms of a great husband, Hector, now lowly cattle, or like chattel, in the power of proud Pyrrhus, next to the empty tomb, bent over an empty tomb in a swoon, not in ecstasy, but in a swoon. The widow of Hector, alas, and the wife of Helenus. And then we build to the climax, the last three stanzas. And this, I think, is the most beautiful part of the poem. He then imagines, or he remembers seeing a black woman, a black African woman. Je pense à la négresse, amaigrie, wasted, et physique, and consumptive. She's clearly not well. Piétinant dans la boue, trudging through the mud. She also is out of her element. Et cherchant and looking with haggard gaze for the absent cocoa palms of proud Africa. She's such a long way from her natural home. And those cocotiers, those cocoa palms, are hidden behind the huge wall. Muraille is a fortified wall of Parisian fog, brouillard. I'm thinking of quiconque, this is the most beautiful line of all, la quiconque a perdu, of whoever has lost that which can never be found again. I'm thinking of those who drink copiously of tears and suckle grief, not pain. I think grief here is my preferred translation, like a good she-wolf, a memory of Romulus Remus, the foundation of Rome. I'm thinking of, you have to understand this each time, the puny orphans desiccating, drying up, withering like little flowers. And so, and then in the final stanza, and so in the forest of memories in which my soul takes refuge, exiles itself. An old memory, capital S, important, sounds a loud clarion call. He's mixing the senses here, again, very Baudelaire. I'm thinking of castaways, sailors forgotten, abandoned on an island. I'm thinking of captives. We're coming back to Andromaque again. I'm thinking of captives and vanquished, Andromaque again. And then a pregnant pause. And then the final exclamation, I'm thinking of so many others. And there you have the poem. Now, I'm conscious that time is going on. I would just like to read the poem through in its entirety once more in French. And then I hope there'll be time for some questions. Can we go back to the, I think it's slide 7, or yeah, that's fine. That's fine, Lynn, if you can bear with me. Let me just have a glass to wet my vocal cords. So here it is, and listen to the music. There's so much repetition, so much assonance in the poem. Andromaque, je pense à vous, ce petit fleuve pauvre et triste miroir où jadis resplendit l'immense majesté de vos douleurs de veuve, ce Simoïs menteur qui par vos pleurs grandit, a fécondé soudain ma mémoire fertile, comme je traversais le nouveau Carrousel. Le vieux Paris n'est plus, la forme d'une ville change plus vite, hélas, que le cœur d'un mortel. Je ne vois qu'en esprit tout ce camp de baraques, ces tas de chapiteaux ébauchés et de fûts, les herbes, les gros blocs verdis par l'eau des flaques, et brillant au carreau, le bric-à-brac confus. Là s'étalait jadis une ménagerie. Là je vis un matin, à l'heure où sous les cieux froids et clairs le travail s'éveille, où la voirie pousse un sombre ouragan dans l'air silencieux, un cygne qui s'était évadé de sa cage et de ses pieds palmés frottant le pavé sec, sur le sol raboteux traînait son blanc plumage. Près d'un ruisseau sans eau, la bête ouvrant le bec baignait nerveusement ses ailes dans la poudre et disait, le cœur plein de son beau lac natal, « Oh, quand donc pleuvras-tu, quand tonneras-tu foudre ?» Je vois ce malheureux, mythe étrange et fatal, vers le ciel quelquefois comme l'homme d'Ovide, vers le ciel ironique et cruellement bleu, sur son cou convulsif tendant sa tête avide, comme s'il adressait des reproches à Dieu. Paris change, mais rien dans ma mélancolie n'a bougé. Palais neuf, échafaudage, bloc, vieux faubourg. Tout pour moi devient allégorie et mes chers souvenirs sont plus lourds que des rocs. Aussi devant ce Louvre, une image m'opprime. Je pense à mon grand Cygne, avec ses gestes fous, comme les exilés, ridicules et sublimes, et rongés d'un désir sans trêve. Et puis à vous, Andromaque, des bras d'un grand époux tombé, vil bétail, sous la main du superbe Pyrrhus, auprès d'un tombeau vide en extase courbée, veuve d'Hector, hélas, et femme d'Hélénus. Je pense à la négresse, amaigrie et phtisique, piétinant dans la boue et cherchant l'œil hagard les cocotiers absents de la superbe Afrique derrière la muraille immense du brouillard. À quiconque a perdu ce qui ne se retrouve jamais, jamais, à ceux qui s'abreuvent de pleurs et têtent la douleur comme une bonne louve, aux maigres orphelins séchant comme des fleurs. Ainsi, dans la forêt où mon esprit s'exile, un vieux souvenir sonne à plein souffle du corps. Je pense aux matelots oubliés dans une île, aux captifs, aux vaincus, à bien d'autres encore. I'm now very happy to take questions, comments, anything, and thank you for your patience. That was a little longer, but then I don't often get a captive audience, so I rather like speaking. Forgive me.
Thank you, Peter. That was rather just beautiful and inspiring, and I can well see what a fantastic teacher you must have, well, you still are. I'm just going to read something from Alvin, which I on the message board. I've read this poem before, Alvin says. In fact, Alvin, do you want to read that out yourself? Are you unmuted?
Beam him up.
Come on, Alvin.
I am now unmuted, Sean. Yes. Hello, guys.
Hello,
Peter.
hi.
Yeah.
That was most enjoyable. That was magnifique. Merci beaucoup. So I just said, so I've read this poem before, and I've read it again over the last day or two just to refresh my memory.
Hold on.
So I did my homework, but I mean, I think l'explication du texte that you've taken us through, Peter, has brought it to life so much more and revealed so much more, because it just shows how deep and meaningful.
There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. So that's why, you know, it's sort of, we read poetry, we probably pretend to people sort of reread poetry that we're familiar with. So we seldom get the opportunity to sort of do this with something that we're not really familiar with, and get someone like you to take the time, to force us to take the time to study it really hard. The more you study it, the more it reveals, you know, the references that need explaining, the classical mythology and so on. But then just the explication of, you know, the context, the language, the rhyming patterns and all of that. It was really good. So I really enjoyed it, but it just reminds me.
I hope you could hear at the end some of the musicality of the verse. There's so much repetition. There's so much assonance within line. It's very, very rich poetically. And every time I read it, I see something new. So that was really my purpose. It's not the easiest of poems, this. I mean, it's quite difficult to get into it because those classical allusions at the beginning are quite, you know, tough to get through.
Yeah.
And you have to get over that. There are more accessible Baudelaire poems, but I'm particularly fond of it. I think this is just a thing of great beauty.
Great.
It's Andy Barsby. Hi.
Thanks.
Andy,
Hi, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Peter, that was excellent, really splendid. Would Baudelaire have been familiar with Racine and, you know, the classical allusions? Is that where he would have got his classical reference?
he was a well-educated boy. He was at Louis Le Grand before his expulsion, which is one of the top two lycées in Paris, and he was clearly a precocious and clever boy, but inherited, I think, the characteristics of his first father, who died when he was 6, who was more artistic in nature and therefore was a disappointment. So yes, he would have been classically educated, and so they would have been steeped in 17th century tragedians. And in fact, if you look at his verse, and you know, I know you know, that he's using the Alexandrian. This verse form, as a versifier, Baudelaire is not being in the slightest bit innovative here. He's using a classical idiom, which was the main versification in French poetry from the 16th up to 19th centuries. He does experiment in some other poems, a lovely poem called L'Invitation au Voyage, where he experiments with other rhythms. But this is bog standard French Alexandrian. There are things like enjambement, he lapses from one line to another, and there is more detail there. But yeah, he would have been very, very familiar with Racine, who wrote exquisite poetry, as you know. Yeah.
Thanks.
Jamie, you got your hand. Would you like to ask something?
My metaphorical hand up. Yeah, Peter, unbelievable, and God, what a lovely break from Midtown Manhattan for this.
You doing deals out there, Jamie?
What's that?
I hope you're not neglecting the deals you're meant to be organising.
No, they're knocking down our building, the old headquarters, floor by floor with jackhammers. So it's actually not unlike the Paris of Victor Hugo. So I have two questions quickly. One was, did Victor Hugo respond to this, since it was written to him? And then the second, more frivolous question is, would you, do you think, have expelled Baudelaire for eating the note as a headmaster yourself?
Well, let me take the first one first while I think of an answer for the second. There was contact between Hugo and Baudelaire, but I think it was largely correspondence, because Hugo remained in exile until 1871, I believe, by which time Baudelaire was dead. So all I know, and I confess my ignorance here, there was some correspondence. I know that Baudelaire did not have a high opinion of the at times rather emphatic poetry of Hugo, although he did write some lovely stuff. I'm not sure how keen Hugo was on Baudelaire, but he would have been flattered, I'm sure, to have been identified as a key Republican. He was actually. Hugo was a brave man. He did stand up on the barricades as a Republican. So they may have met in 1848 to 1852. 1852, Hugo basically legged it to the Channel Islands. So there would have been some contact. I don't know how much.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have expelled.
You say that now.
With the wisdom of old age, there are a number of people I might have expelled in the past who I rather regret doing that now, if times have been different. But, as Rousseau says, man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. And any head has expectations to manage and can only work within the culture of the time and the expectations of parents if he wants to keep his job, which I did because I had a mortgage to pay. So I think I would have had a very stern word with Charles because he openly defied a teacher, and I did actually send one or two individuals away from Latimer for being grotesquely and personally rude to a teacher. Let's not use monosyllables in case any children are watching, but I think you can understand what I mean. I thought that was crossing a line which was unacceptable. But no, I think.
And is it too early to know if either of them have become famous poets?
Yes, it is. You need to experience far more misery in your life.
Right.
Jamie, you have far too happy a life to write poetry of this beauty. Yours would be very banal, I think.
I fear you're right.
Great to see.
Richard Bridges, would you like to read out your question?
Yeah, thank you. It just occurred to me as you were reading beautifully through the end of the poem. Ainsi dans la forêt où mon esprit s'exile, un vieux souvenir sonne à plein souffle du corps. And I was thinking, well, hang on, so which old memory? Are we back to the Swan, or is he being deliberately vague?
I think it's
is it just any memory that he's not going to tell us about?
I think souvenir with a capital S suggests it's a kind of absolute. There is memory, capital M, coming back to him. And so it's if you like, it's an amalgam of memories. It's prompted by the stream, which makes him think of Andromache, which makes him think of exile, which makes him remember the swan, which then makes him think of those other things. And so at the end here, what I like, by the way, this is a lovely example of what's called synesthesia, where one sense can suggest another. He wrote a beautiful poem called Correspondance, which is very famous, but where a color will suggest a sound, for example, or a taste. And here the fusion of different senses. And so here, how can a memory make a sound? But it rings, it's as if a horn is blowing in his mind with this memory. I think it's a conflation of lots of memories, Richard, but it's a simple answer to your question.
Can I just say, for what it's worth, Jeremy Jeans in about 1979 or something did a lunchtime class. I think it was a sort of an extra class, and he read Le ciel basé lourd pèse comme un couvercle. You can remind me which one that is.
That's Spleen, yes. That's
Spleen, yeah.
Commit suicide too.
Right, and I just reread it, and he went through it. It was just a lunchtime thing for those who were interested,
yeah.
And it pretty much changed my life. It's just very nice to come back to the. I feel that after however 40 years or something, I've reconnected. Thank you very much.
And I reassure you that, notwithstanding that poem, that life is pretty good. That really is a very doom-laden poem. But I did say this to the ladies at Latimer, were there to be sufficient interest in Baudelaire after this talk, and there may well not, I would love to do a couple more poems, and that would be one of them. And I've got a few poems lined up because there are so many interesting themes in Baudelaire which will bear further exploration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Aspden, did you want to ask something?
Oh, I hope he's not going to ask he's not going to ask me a difficult one, is he, Sean?
Yeah.
I don't know. Hello, Pete.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. I don't think you ever taught me French, although now that you've picked up with all those registers, I'm really nervous.
Your forward defensive in the second.
Well, is that what I was going to say? Killer. I've never been out since. So I was lucky enough to do an interview with Patti Smith a few years ago, and she talked at length about poets, her great literary heroes, which are Rimbaud and Verlaine, but also about Baudelaire, and stressing that he was an absolute forerunner and a key figure of modernism. And he himself said, "Il faut être de son temps." And yet we see this poem, which is full of melancholy and looking to the past. I mean, anything but modernist. I wondered, was that contradiction running more through his...
Baudelaire's a poet of contradictions, basically. I mean, think of ridicule et sublime. That just that sums it up. One section of Les Fleurs du Mal is called Spleen et Idéal. So spleen, that profound disenchantment with life. It means far more than ennui, boredom. Ennui was used as a term, but it means a profound disenchantment, a huge déprime, depression. Whereas idéal is that aspiration. Baudelaire saw himself as a poet, as a prophet with his feet in the mud, in the gutter, but his head was in the stars. And of course, the plebs, the hoi polloi of literary critics didn't understand him. They didn't get him, which is why he went to Belgium, which would depress most people. I thought it would have been certainly, unless he got mussels and chips online. But he was, in use of his poetic forms, he was quite traditional, and in use of the Alexandrine. But some of his themes, for example, this mixing of senses, he was an early symbolist poet, whatever that means, and that's another discussion itself, which I'd better not get into, I don't know much about it. But he was modern in some ways and traditional in others. But this poem, to someone familiar with French poetry up to 1860, is very much a traditional shape and form.
Thank you.
Can I just make one very quick plug for a wonderful bookshop called Shakespeare and Company in Paris, which is a fantastic place. It's having a lot of problems, like all indie bookshops. If everyone there got online and bought a book from them, it would help them hugely.
We were there last year, and my wife has just gone running off to find the mug, which we bought in the shop. I had my evening coffee out of it.
Oh, lovely. No, I haven't got it. Brilliant. Good. Howard Witts. Howard, hello, Howard.
Howard.
Oh, hi. Just one question. How would this poem have been consumed by people at the time? Would it have been a few readers in the salon that would know the classical references, or would it be the wider public? When it was published, who would have read it?
I've no idea how many read it, Howard, but it didn't meet with great critical acclaim, which is one of the reasons why Baudelaire was very aware of his own genius. I think he was a genius. He was aware of it, and he was very irritated by the fact that not many other people recognized him as a genius, as a prophet, as a spokesman for his age. So there is that. One of the great irritations of his life, the most famous literary critic, the man who set opinion in mid-19th century France, was a man called Sainte-Beuve. He's a bit of a boring old stick, really, and he never declared Baudelaire as a genius. He never really bigged up his poetry, and it really grated with Baudelaire. He never got that recognition, and so Baudelaire was friendly with familiar names. Delacroix was a hero of his. Manet was an associate of his who painted Jeanne Duval, his mistress, the famous painting of Jeanne Duval by Manet. He knew a lot of these people, a lot of the names that you'd associate at that time. And he had his fans. He definitely had his fans. Flaubert was a fan of his. Of course, I'm coming on to Flaubert in my next talk, but both of them have the distinction of having written a great piece of literature in the very same year. and having it prosecuted for obscenity within 3 months of each other. Flaubert was prosecuted in February 1857 and Baudelaire in April. And Flaubert wrote to Baudelaire to commiserate with him and say, good on you, you know? And of course, a bit of scandal doesn't do you any harm. You think of D.H. Lawrence and Lady Chatterley's Lover more recently, you know, a succès de scandale in the French. So he gained a certain notoriety, but Baudelaire was born to be bitter, basically. You know, he was not a man of his time. He didn't want to be a lawyer, thank God. He didn't want to be a diplomat. He wanted to write poetry, you know. He wanted to move people. He wanted to shake people's souls, and he did that. That's his legacy. But sadly, he wasn't really recognised during his lifetime. He's now, I think, serious French opinion would, if you say who's the greatest French poet, he'd be one of the names you think of immediately, with perhaps Ronsard in the 16th century. Yeah, he's right up there. Great to see you, Howard. I can't believe it. Amazing.
Nigel Connell.
Nigel, mon pote, where is he?
He's lost.
No, he's gone.
Lost.
Come on, step forward. You've never been bashful before.
No, he's
Well,
gone.
whilst we're waiting, Emilio, did you want to share some thoughts?
Yes, no, I was, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hi.
Yeah, I was going to ask something about the relationship between Hugo and Baudelaire, but it's interesting because I found that there is two things. There was correspondence specifically, I think, about this poem, and it's funny because Hugo actually highlights exactly the same thing that Peter, you highlights as the most interesting part, the last part, La muraille de Brouillard.
Yeah.
He highlights exactly that part, which you said is the most beautiful.
Well, perhaps I'm a visionary like Baudelaire. I'll let you believe that, even if it's not true.
But would you consider this his best poem?
It's one of my favourites, is all I can say. I don't think I'm qualified to judge his best, but I think his two greatest poems for me are this, Le Cygne, and the final poem of Les Fleurs du Mal, Le Voyage, where so much of Baudelaire is about going on a journey. Memory, of course, takes him on journeys. And the final journey for Baudelaire, he tries different contents. He said his prose poems as well. And one of his prose poems called N'importe où, pourvu que c'est hors de ce monde, as long as it's out of this world. And the final journey, of course, is death. And the conclusion, rather sadly, in Les Fleurs du Mal is, well, maybe we'll try death. That's the great, what's beyond? And as a believer in God, perhaps he did believe in an after. I don't know enough about Baudelaire to be confident about that, but those are the two poems I particularly like. But he wrote two extraordinary poems, which I think are amongst the sexiest poems. I don't say that word cheaply in the French language. One is called La Chevelure, and one is called Parfum Exotique. And both of them are focused on Jeanne Duval, his mistress. Parfum Exotique, he leans down and smells her breast and goes off on a mental journey. In La Chevelure, she's got this great big shock of hair. Cheveux in French is hair. Chevelure means a thick mane of hair. And he shakes her hair and then breathes in, and then that takes him on a mental journey. And it's extraordinary. It's most beautiful. But I fear that, you know, modern opinion would probably characterize Baudelaire as a misogynist. I mean, he had deeply ambivalent feelings about women, about sex, lust and horror. I think he was probably into, you know, without becoming prurient, sadomasochism, you know, harm, evil, pain. These things are connected within his mind. And I say, I don't think he had an entirely straightforward or happy life. As a teacher, of course, I always blame his parents.
Gerard, did you want to share your thoughts?
One of my own heroes.
Yeah.
Yes, Gerard.
He's in Poland.
Gerard's in Poland. He's in Krakow. Where is he?
Oh.
Please speak. Nigel and Gerard must speak.
No, okay.
No?
We lost Nigel and Gerard.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
That's good. No, it's very nice to be listen to that from Krakow here. But particularly, I loved the contrast between the very tight form of the poem and the randomness of his thought. So it's almost ostentatiously accidental as the poem goes. So
How random his thought is, Gerard.
Yes.
I would argue it's actually quite tightly constructed in the way that, for example, he returns to captivity and exile at the end. So he implicitly he's referencing Andromaque right in the final line of the poem. So there is a real tight structure.
That, yes. And the other thing I wondered is about L'Homme d'Ovid, is whether this is actually a reference to Icarus.
I didn't hear the...
L'Homme d'Ovid.
Oh, the Homme d'Ovid. Well, you may, Gerard, as a classical scholar, I think you may well know more than I about it. I'm puzzled by L'Homme d'Ovid, Ovid's man.
Exactly.
I wondered if that meant Ovid himself. Does it mean something different?
Well, I thought that because of the whole thing of that stanza is about rising towards the sky, vers le ciel, whether it's about man moving out into the ultimate and failing. You know, it's rising and failing
towards the sky. Was Icarus Ovid's man?
Well, that's what he's certainly in the Metamorphoses.
Well, Gerard, I think you've taught me something there, as you've done so often in my life. For those who don't know Gerard, he's one of the very finest English teachers I've ever known, and my children both were very, very pleased to be taught English by him at King Edward School, Bath.
Well,
You're right. I defer.
But of course, he's also the subject of Bruegel's famous La Chute d'Icare, which is in Brussels, actually, another good thing in Belgium. Auden wrote a wonderful poem about the painting.
I think you're right. I was unaware of this reference of Icarus, but it makes absolute sense because he's straining skyward and yet brought crashing back to earth. And that ties in with the swan waddling through the mud and dreaming of water. So and that's you've helped me there. Thank you, Joe. That's great. And clearly tonight all roads lead to Belgium. It's a slightly worrying thought.
We've probably only got time for one or two, Sarah. Sarah Mitchell.
I kind of feel like I'm the American press that's just making everything about America again, just like they did with Bonfire Night, fireworks being for Biden. But I mean, I kind of get a sense, would Baudelaire and Walt Whitman have known each other's work? The not so much the tight form of Baudelaire, this poem of Baudelaire's, but just the expressive thoughts, the kind of repetition, the rhythm brings to mind to me a lot like Leaves of Grass, which was just around the same time. And I'm wondering if is there anything going on between those two cultures at the time, or it's just.
And I didn't get the other part.
Well, Whitman.
The simple and honest answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I just don't know. I'm not aware. It may well have been, but I don't know enough about Whitman to comment, I'm afraid.
Can I come in there? There is a comparison to be struck in the sense that both poets, both Baudelaire and Whitman, kept increasing their books, as it were, by adding extra poems throughout their lives.
Yes.
But I don't think they ever were aware of each other. I mean, Whitman might have been aware of Baudelaire, but Baudelaire definitely wasn't aware of Whitman.
Yeah.
Right. Of course, the American writer that Baudelaire was very aware of was Edgar Allan Poe.
Exactly, yeah.
Made Poe very popular and famous in France. And there are some interesting and quite sad parallels about their life and early death, in fact.
Definitely. And one more thing, if I could say, I think that one of the reasons that Baudelaire wrote in strict metrical forms was that it was the only way he had of imposing order on his life, because everything else was rackety and chaotic.
I think that's a very interesting theory.
And
and
that's something he shares with Lord Byron, who, you know, as the great romantic poet, always rhymes and always writes in strict meter, but has this terribly chaotic.
Well, that is the classical side of Baudelaire, which is to impose order on chaos. Which is,
exactly, yeah, yeah.
But there is a romantic side to Baudelaire, which expressed in some other poems, and
sure. But he invariably rhymes.
He looks two ways. He looks
Yeah.
two ways, I think.
Yeah.
And therein lies part of his richness, I believe.
Absolutely, yeah.
Shard, I think Nigel's still trying to
Yeah,
get...
Nigel's accused me of cutting him off. I'm so sorry, Nigel. I didn't hear you. Are you there?
No,
he's not. No,
Nigel, have you...
Am I there? Am I there now?
Oh, yes, there you are.
Have I unmuted?
You've unmuted.
Oh, there.
Three things very quickly. One, Sean, you should be on telly because you've definitely got the persona.
Thank you.
I think Nigel's got a thing about you.
Let's move on. Peter, two things. Was Baudelaire not the first sex, drugs, and rock and roll guy to really make it? I mean, can you honestly say to me, it's well documented he took wine and hashish and opium, whatever, to write. Are you telling me that was the wrong course, or is that the right way to go? I'm thinking of the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's. And finally, why did he draw on classical imagery so much? Was it just to add gravitas to his writing?
Well, let me start with the last one. Why? Because he was classically educated, à la française. He would have been steeped in the classics of French literature at school. I think that's answer enough. You know how much the French worship their own cultural past, more so than we do, I think, as a nation. And so he would be steeped in the whole 17th century is the neoclassical age, was imitating the classical time. So I think, probably enough said, I think Baudelaire is one of many 19th century poets. In fact, you might be hard pressed to find a 19th century poet who wasn't under the influence of drugs. I mean, Coleridge, I believe, was an addict. I mean, Gerard is far more qualified to talk on this, not because of his use of drugs, by the way, because of his knowledge of English literature than I am. But, it's a trite saying that you can't, great suffering gives birth to great literature. And I think in Baudelaire's case, he did manage to create, without being trite again, flowers, things of beauty from pretty sordid life. I mean, he didn't have a happy time. He died a ghastly death. He suffered physically throughout his life. He didn't feel recognized by his contemporaries, but he's not alone. There were many English poets. I was reading about this. I forget the names. It was Browning. I won't even try and remember the names, but there were many English writers in the mid-90s who equally suffered from their drug use, stroke abuse. It's arguable, actually. I don't think Baudelaire was really kind of doors of perception. Let's expand the universe. I don't think that was his motive for taking alcohol and drugs. I think he was trying to kill the pain. I think it was sedative. I think he was in pain, physical and spiritual pain. And I think those drugs, if you like, helped to deaden the pain. And he did probably become addicted to laudanum. He was one of many.
I agree with you, Peter. How do you think Baudelaire would have handled lockdown?
Well, I think lockdown may be turning a number of us into Baudelaires. I don't know. And then let us hope that, if nothing else, lockdown gives rise to great poetry, Nigel.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess, I'm going to give the last word to Arabella Stewart, who says, thank you, Peter. I wish you taught me. And I think those of us who haven't been taught by you, Peter, echo that. Thank you for such a fantastic. I'm so sorry, we probably don't have time to is there one more?
Here's a student of French who needs to be listened to. Come on, Nick. What do you got for me?
Actually, I just pressed the unmute to say thank you very much. but while I'm there, and I can't compete with many of the people who've made comments this year, I'm interested in one small thing about Les Fleurs du Mal of Baudelaire, and that is you've introduced me to a wonderful poem full of sensitivity, emotion, and beauty. Where did Baudelaire go that managed to get 6 of his poems that offended the public morals so much that he was penalized for it. What was the territory he went into that the France of those days was so upset by?
Sadomasochism and lesbianism.
Oh, just that.
Just that. I have the poems in this edition. There are only 6 of them, and I don't think any of them is better than the poems actually in. But I think that was a bridge too far. Baudelaire does at times associate cruelty and physical pain with sex, not always, which I think was probably crossing a line. And he makes various sapphic comments in 1 or 2 of his poems. I think one is called Lesbos, which may have stretched the tolerance of mid-19th century France. And if any of you carry on to my talk on Flaubert in January, he likewise was prosecuted, and I defy you to find elements of well, you will find them, I suppose, but you know, Flaubert is really quite discreet on matters sexual, although there is a lot of there's a big sexual element in Madame Bovary. So sensitivities change. But it was basically those 2 things. It was the association, one is opening up a wound in the woman and plunging his spear into her side. And there's all kinds of metaphors going on there, I'm sure. The other was references to lesbian love, which I think was a bridge too far.
Thank you.
Peter, you mentioned your next talk on Flaubert's Madame Bovary. It's the 19th of January. If our new tutorial group would like to sign up, I mean it's a bit early, but let's hope that we can all meet again on the 19th.
Yeah. It gives me time to reread the novel and think of something to say.
Gives us all time. Thank you, and thank you to you, our audience, for asking such great questions and making the evening such good fun. And Peter, you know, thank you. It was fantastic. I feel like I can kind of understand a bit of French now. And thank you for sorting out my mispronunciation of Cygne and Songe, which was nightmares, frankly.
No nightmares. Thank you. Sean and Lynn and Joe, thank you for your help, and grateful thanks to everyone who took the time to come in. I hope you join me again in future. I'm rather enjoying this, so you're indulging.
So always, thank you, and good night, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah.